Hi everyone, this is the first in a series of recordings that will introduce you to the fundamentals of Adobe Illustrator, which is a computer program that we use when we're dealing with vector files. So vector files are those that have vector information in them, meaning it has information in them that's scalable without losing resolution. The opposite of vector files are raster files or image files. So think of a photograph that you might take at a certain resolution. So when we are working in architectural communications, raster files are something that we work with in Photoshop, which is another Adobe program, and vector files like drawings, things that come out of CAD documents, or when you're making new graphics or things that are made through a series of lines rather than images, we'll be working in Illustrator. The format is also something that you would use to choose what type of information you're going to be exporting to. So for example, if you're making a presentation board, you would likely work in Illustrator, whereas if you were making a book or a booklet or a pamphlet or something that is a multiple page kind of serial publication or document, you would be working in InDesign. And we will cover those other programs in future tutorials about those. So the first part of this tutorial is going to cover the basic interface in Illustrator. It's going to talk about how you select things, how you set up rulers and guides, and how you begin drawing lines. Subsequent tutorials will talk about text and text objects and paragraphs, drawing curves. We'll cover live trace or image trace as it's called in the current version, converting text to outlines, and also creating or also using some of the more advanced commands in Illustrator like the blend tool and some of the clipping masks. So we're going to get started here. I'm going to open up Illustrator. I'm going to start a new document. So under the top toolbar, File, New, pretty straightforward, and it's going to come up and give you a series of options that you can choose to make the new document. So you can, in this initial dialog box, you can just hit OK and go forward and start, once you're in the file, adjusting things, or you can in here start creating, embedding some information in it. So I can say that I want to give it a name. This is going to be my sample file. I can give it a profile, meaning these are presets that are based on what you want the output of the document to be. So if you're going to print it, if you're going to put it on the web, those sorts of things, you're probably going to be customizing most documents, or you'll be creating your own presets and then you can save them. So that's what this means. Down here, the number of artboards. Artboards in Illustrator, and it'll be a little bit more clear when we get into the document, are the kind of virtual sheets of paper that you're going to be using or that you're going to be outputting. So right now we're going to work with one artboard, but in newer versions of Illustrator, after about release 3 or 4, you can create multiple artboards, which you weren't previously able to do. So we're going to leave that at 1 for now. The size, it will give you a series of presets for size. So letter is 8.5 by 11, legal is 8.5 by 14, and tabloid is 11 by 17. Those are the kind of basic presets for things that you can print on a laser printer or an inkjet printer. Larger sizes you can also make. You can create a custom size in here, and you'll see that the units right now are in points. If we change those over here to inches, you can see what the translation of the preset size is, and you can also customize these. So if we wanted to make a 24-inch by 36-inch sheet, we can just type that in here under width and height. The orientation, allows you to toggle back and forth between portrait, which means tall, or landscape, meaning wide. And you can see over here when you toggle back and forth, it automatically updates the relationship of those numbers to each other. We're not going to worry about bleeds for now. If you open up Advanced, the color mode that you want to be working in is depending on what your output's going to be. Most often you're going to be exporting these files that you're making in Illustrator to print for a presentation. And in that case, you want to be working in a CMYK color space, or cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And this relates to the colors of ink that are used by an inkjet printer or a plotter to create the color on your sheets. RGB is red, green, blue, and that would be a color space that you would use if you're going to export something on a computer screen. So if you're going to be presenting something digitally, you would want to be working in RGB color space. At this point in your development, you're not really going to see a huge difference between the two of them, but it's best to start getting into the habit of knowing what you want to do now, and this will allow for you to have better color translation from what you see on the screen to what prints out. We'll talk about printing later. It's always going to be a matter of fine-tuning things to be able to get the color out of the computer or out of the printer that you intend, but the first place to start is by choosing the right color mode. So once I've set up those settings, or once I've changed those settings, I can hit OK, and it's going to create that page for me. And so we can see here that I have a kind of a white rectangle here that's representing my sheet of paper. Again, this is called the artboard in Illustrator, and then this gray area to the outside of it that's your kind of virtual tabletop is what's called a pasteboard in Illustrator. So this is the area that we're going to be working in. I'm just going to slide this over so you can see all of the screen here. So the other kind of general things that you have in your interface when you're working in Illustrator are a series of tool palettes over here on the left, and this will allow for you to kind of click on an icon and start that tool. So if I wanted to start typing something, I would click on the T for the type tool. If I wanted to select something, I would click on this black arrow for the selection tool. If you hover over any of the tools, it will give you a tooltip, which is this little yellow box that pops up, and it'll tell you the name of the tool and also the shortcut for it. So the little letter in parentheses after the name of the tool is the shortcut. So if I want to start the type tool, I can either click on this icon here, or I can type in T and it will automatically switch. I can type in V and switch to direct selection, and so on and so forth. At the top here you have what's called the control panel, and that has in it, it has the commands that are specific to the tool that you have currently selected, and it also has options for document setup, preferences, and some kind of selecting similar objects. So if I click on document setup, it brings me back to something that allows for me to adjust the bleed and the transparency and the type options. And then the preferences are where I can start adjusting things like units. If I hadn't changed my units to points in the original dialog box, I could do that here. And I can set up some other general settings in here. I could adjust some of the general settings in here. We're not going to get into most of these right now, but this is where you would find them. And then over here on the right side are what are called panels. And so you'll see that there are tabs that allow you to open up different types of information or information related to the name of the panel. So layers, image trace options, color guide, character, paragraph, all sorts of different types of options are embedded in here. And depending on how you have your panels set up, you might have them kind of over here to the side, and when you click on one of these icons it'll bring up that group of panels, or you might have them expanded so that you see them at all times and they kind of expand and collapse. You can add to or subtract from these panels in a couple of different ways. Under Window, all of these listed items here are panels that you can open here on the right side. So if I wanted to open up Actions, I could click on that, open it up, and it opens as a floating panel, and I can then dock it over here on the right just by grabbing the top bar, not where it says the panel. This has two tabs within it, so it has both actions and links. And if I want to take one of them, I can grab just the tab and then dock it up here somewhere. Or if I want to take both of them, so if I put this guy back over here, if I want to take both of them, I can grab the top bar, and you'll see that instead of a square that's telling me I'm adding actions to an existing grouping of panels or grouping of tabs, it will allow for me to take both of them and insert them as a new grouping over here on the right. You can also grab ones that are already docked and pull them to the side and then close them, and so that will take them out of the right side, and then to start those back up again, you just go over here to the right and you choose the panel, and it will open it back up. There should be a series of presets that you can choose from in the workspace. So that should be in here. Window, Workspace. I currently have the Essentials working. You can go into some of these other presets if they are more of interest to you. You can go around and play with those. What I'm working in is Essentials. And so if you go in there under Window and Workspace and click on that, your screen should look pretty similar to mine. Although, like I said before, you might have this kind of collapsed over here to the right. And you click on this little double arrow here on the top of the series of panels to expand or collapse that. Okay, so those are kind of what things are called and where they're located. In here, this is, as you probably know, this is one file at a time. I can open up multiple files. Not sure what's in this guy, but we can open it up and you can see that now I have two different files open. So I can click back and forth on the tabs, close one, or open a new one. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about navigation. Moving around in Illustrator, you're not really rotating around in three-dimensional space or anything like that like you will be doing in some of the 3D modeling programs. But you do want to be able to quickly move around the document. So some shortcuts, and these are listed in your PDF handouts, are, depending on if you're working in a PC or a Mac, Command or Control 0 will zoom to the extents of the artboard. So Command 0 in my case because I'm on a Mac. Substitute Control if you're on a PC. Command 1 will allow for you to look at something at 100%, so it zooms to 100%, and that's opacity. It will zoom to 100%, meaning that the size of the object on your screen should be the size of the object in real life, depending on the resolution of your screen. And then Command or Control and the plus or minus keys will let you step zoom in or out. So those are pretty helpful. You're going to be zooming in and out all the time. And if you are zoomed in, it's a little tough to tell. Let me draw something on here so that you can see what we're looking at. See that we are looking at something. I'm just going to draw a black square, rectangle actually. So I'm going to zoom into one of the corners of it. And if you hold down the space bar, it will let you then pan around. So if you want to move to a different part of the object but not zoom in or out, you can hold down the space bar and then use your mouse to drag in one direction or the other. Okay? So Command or Control 0, full screen of the artboard. Command 1 or Control 1 is 100% zoom, and Command or Control with the plus or minus keys will let you step zoom in or out. In terms of document setup, we did this a little bit at the beginning, but if you have opened a document and you want to change something about it, like if you want to change it from landscape to portrait orientation, or if you want to change the units or the size of it, under File, Document Setup, you should be able to get into this dialog box and then click on Edit Artboards to edit the size of the thing. So I'm going to zoom out so you can see my artboard. You can see now that it's giving me a little label here on the top left that tells me this is Artboard 1. Again, we only have one artboard in this document, so if we had more, there would be multiples. And then it lets me see the size of this here. So the width and the height of the document are adjustable here. So if I wanted to make this 18 by 24 instead of 24 by 36, I can type in 24 and then 18, hitting Tab, and it's adjusting those for me. I can also, on the left here, toggle back and forth between portrait and landscape. And if I were wanting to add a new artboard, I could do that here. This little icon that looks like a page with its corner turned up will be the universal symbol for new blank, new something in all of the Adobe programs. So in this case, it's new artboard. Right now, I'm happy with the change in size that I've made, and I'm going to click on the selection tool, which will get me out of that edit artboard kind of space. Okay. The next tools that we're going to talk about are these two here on the top, the selection tools. The one on the left is called just the regular selection tool, and the one to the right is called the direct selection tool. The shortcuts are V and A for both of those. And again, all of these are, all of this information is also located in your PDF, so if you're having trouble remembering all of these, you'll be able to refer back to it. The difference between the two of them is that the selection tool, or the black arrow, when you click on something, it's going to be working with the whole thing at one time. So if I wanted to click on this rectangle and move it around the screen, I could click on it, and I'm going to click on it where there's kind of meat to the object. So in this case, I just have an outline. Now I just have an outline. So if I try to click inside of that, there's nothing of that object there. So I need to click on where there's actually something, right? So right now it just has a line, and we'll talk about this in a minute, what these mean. If I were to reverse these and have an object that is a fill, I could click on it anywhere and move it around. This selection tool, the black arrow, allows for you to scale things, move them, rotate them, depending on how you're using some of the kind of prompts that come up with the different arrows. If I choose the other selection tool, the direct selection tool, this lets me work with one part of an object at one time. So instead of clicking on an object and getting the whole thing, if I zoom in here, you can see a little bit that I now have a blue filled in rectangle or square at the corner of the object, but the other corners are have a blue outline with a white fill. What that means is that when we click on one corner, you can grab just that corner, just that edge, or some combination of the two by drawing a box around things and move things in different ways. So if you're trying to adjust a part of an object, you use the white arrow. If you're trying to adjust the whole object, you use the black arrow. And I'm using another shortcut, Command or Control Z, which is undo, to step back several steps in the sequence that I just made. I'm going to draw a few more rectangles here so that we have a few more to work with, because we're going to be adding to and subtracting from the selection. So I can click on something and select one at a time, and I'm back with my selection tool, the black arrow. If I want to add things to the selection, I can either hold down the Shift button and click on the other things that I want to add, and you can see that this blue rectangle that indicates the total area that you're working with something is expanding to include all of the different objects. Or I can hold down Control to remove something from the object, or remove something from the selection. I'm sorry. It's actually hold down Shift, strike that. Add to the selection, or remove something that's already selected from the selection. So again, click on something, hold down Shift, add to it, and you can also keep Shift held down and subtract from it. So now I just have one or two things selected. You can also use the what's called a kind of a sweep, or a kind of a selection by dragging and making a selection box, and you can kind of define which objects you want to include in that selection. When we get into some of the drafting programs, it matters which direction you make a rectangle like this from a selection rectangle from. In Illustrator and InDesign and Photoshop, it does not. So anything that's kind of touching that box that I'm virtually drawing with my selection tool will be selected, and it doesn't matter if I go right to left or left to right, like it will in future programs. Control or Command A allows you to select everything if you want to just make a shortcut or use a shortcut for that, and Command or Control G, so in my case Command G, will group things together, and then Command or Control Shift and G will ungroup them. So if I have this object here and this object here, and they're currently independent, but I want them to work together, I'm going to group them, so Command or Control G, and now when I grab one and move it, the other moves along with it. The same thing with scaling, so if I take something and scale it smaller or larger, both of them will scale. And if I want to decouple them, it's Command or Control Shift and G, so that will ungroup them. So now I can again move them around independently. The fill and stroke of an object are controlled with this little grouping of icons down here on the bottom of your tools palette. I was mentioning before, sometimes you have an object that has just an outline, and that's the only kind of meat of the object that you have to work with, and sometimes it has kind of a full body of content. The way that you distinguish between kind of an outline of something and the interior of it, or the content of it, are by the fill, which means the line around the outside, and the stroke, which means the line around the outside, or the fill, which means the kind of stuff that's inside of it. And so this will be true both of objects in Illustrator and also of text in Illustrator and InDesign, and objects in InDesign as well. So if I have something that has a stroke, it will be indicated over here under stroke, which shows here as kind of a really thick outline. And the way that I give it content, the way that I give it a color is by clicking here on color, or if I want it to not have any stroke, I can click over here to the right and it will disappear, right? So this is the kind of means nothing is happening there. I can switch back and forth between these by bringing the fill to the front or the stroke to the front. So when I bring the fill to the front and add black, it now has a fill to it. And if I want it to also have a stroke, I can click on here and give it a stroke. And I'm just going to change the color so that you can see the difference between the two. And I'm going to make it much thicker so that you can see that there is a, you can see that there is a stroke to it. So again, give it a stroke and make it thicker. So now I have a red outline and a black fill. And again, you can toggle back and forth between these if you want to switch them back and forth. It swaps them here with this little arrow in 2 directions. Or you can revert to the default, which is, the shortcut for it is D, and it will go back to a white fill with a black stroke. The way that you adjust how thick that line is over here in a panel called Stroke. And if you don't have that open, under Window, click on Stroke, or the shortcut for it is F10 or Command F10 on a Mac. In here, the weight of the line is how thick it is, and it's measured in points. So I believe there are 72 points to an inch, and so you can adjust these from 0.0625 of a point, which is really, really thin, to something that's much thicker, like 10 points, or 20 points, or 100 points, depending on what you want it to be. There are a series of presets that you can pick from, and you can also put your mouse, or put your cursor in the box and overwrite it, so if you want something that's 2.5 points, you can type that in. The cap, I'm going to draw a line really quickly just so that we can see what this means, and I'm going to zoom into the end. The cap of something is what the end condition is. So basically, I've drawn this line from one point to another, and it wants to know if at the end of that line I want it to stop exactly, if I want it to have a rounded edge, so again I'm going to zoom in a bit here so you can see, or if I want the edge of the line to extend past it the same thickness as from that point to the edge of the line. So the vector of this line is the thin blue line that has basically no dimension. The stroke of that line tells you how thick the mark is going to be on the page. So from the vector to the edge, which is half of the dimension of the stroke, is how much it would go out if you chose to do it out. The alignment of the stroke you can also adjust. So right now the alignment is to the center. You can also have it adjusted when you have an object that is not just a line. So when I have something that's a square or is a closed shape, I can adjust it to the outside. So if I want it to be aligned to the outside or to the inside, depending on which dimensions you want to hold. And then lastly, over here in this dialog box, you can adjust what the corner condition looks like. So if you want it to be beveled or rounded or rectangular, you can adjust that here. If you make those adjustments when no objects are selected, all future objects will, until you change them, have those options. So if I were to change this to a rounded corner and draw a new box, it's going to have a rounded corner to it, which I can then again adjust by selecting the object and changing it. But there are all of the kind of defaults to something you can adjust when you don't have an object selected for them. So right now, if I adjust the weight to 1, any future box or line that I draw is going to have a 1-point weight to it until I change it. So that's a good way. If you're drawing a bunch of things that you want to be the same, you can adjust them that way. The next thing that we're going to talk about are rulers and guidelines. So we've just been kind of randomly drawing things on this sheet with no real concern about how big they are or where they are in relation to one another. But if we want to start using some some of the alignment tools that are embedded in Illustrator, we need to turn on the rulers. So we can either do that under View, Rulers, Show Rulers, or you can see that the shortcut for it is Command or Control R. So I can toggle those on and off with the Command or Control options. The rulers are also a place where you can adjust the units. So if I want this to be showing in points instead of inches, I can adjust it there. But we're most often going to be working in inches. The other thing that you can do with the rulers is to set the origin. So right now you can see that the ruler is starting from the left side, going to the right side, numbering from 0 to 18 because our sheet is now 18 by 24 inches. And it's also doing the same thing from the top, let me zoom out here, from the top of the page down to the bottom, so from 0 to 24. If we want to change the location of the origin, we can do that. For some reason, if you want the origin to be at the bottom left side of the page, you can take the crosshairs and grab them and drag them and drop them on the bottom corner of the page, or you could set them to some point on the page or the center of the page. The default is typically what you'll be using, so kind of top left, but just know that you can change that if you want. The other thing that opening the guides up allows you to do is to drag rulers out of the guides. So if I click in the ruler area, in the black area that's showing the numbers of the rulers, and pull down, you can see this kind of dashed line that's appearing, it's following my mouse down the page. If I let go, it's going to turn into a kind of a cyan line, which is the color for guides. Guides are reference objects in Illustrator. They do not print. They don't print in InDesign either, but they're something that you can use to help you organize a page. The way that you control the guides is under View, and you have a series of guides here. Right now my guides are locked, which I don't want them to be, so I'm going to uncheck that. And I can also make sure that I am snapping to the guide, so or to hide or show the guides. So under Guides, Smart Guides allows you to snap to them, and then hiding or showing them, the shortcut for it is Command or Control, and then the semicolon key. So that will toggle them on and off. If you don't have your guides locked, you can move them around just by clicking them and grabbing them and dragging them. So I need to unlock my guides. I can now grab it and move it around the page. You can see that when you have a guide selected, in your top dialog box here, it will show you the location of the guide in the X and Y direction. So if I want to set the guide at 4 inches down from the top of the page, I can have the guide selected and type that in here. The width of it you don't really need to worry about. It's kind of extending infinitely in both directions, and the in this case the X or the X location of it doesn't really matter either. I can grab them and bring them from the other side as well, and in this case it's the X dimension or the X location that I want to be able to control. So let's set this at 2 inches, and I can then lock them in place. Guides let me then kind of move things around to them, right? So if I want to have all of these objects aligned kind of at 4 inches down from the top of the page, I can use the guide to allow me to kind of snap to it and get these all aligned. There's other tools that we can use for aligning down in the Align dialog box, but we'll talk about those later. Guides also allow for you to do things like setting margins and all sorts of different types of things. If you are done with the guide, as long as they're not locked, you can click on it and delete it, and you can get rid of it that way. And I've mentioned that guides don't print. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to cover in this portion of the tutorial are lines and polylines. So I'm going to Control A, select everything in my drawing and delete it. So I can start with a fresh slate, a blank slate, and we'll get into some of the drawings with lines. So the line segment tool is the one that you will use if you want to create a segment of a line, or kind of a line that goes from point A to point B. I didn't mention earlier that any of these tool icons that have a little white kind of triangle in the corner have other tools that are embedded within them. So if I press and hold down on that tool, because it has a little white triangle in the corner, it will show me all of the other tools that are in that same location, and I can switch back and forth between them. These are the ones that should show up when you open a new document. They should be the defaults, but for example, if I wanted to be working with circles or ellipses instead of rectangles, I could change that here. There's different type tools. I wouldn't mess around with these. Different types of pen tools and so on and so forth. And we'll cover the more specifics of those in later tutorials. But for now we're working with lines. I just wanted to show you that there are line segments, arcs, spirals, rectangular grids, and polar grids that are all in this same location. So when I click on the line segment tool or type in the shortcut for it, which is the backslash, I can click and drag to draw a line on the page. And so anywhere that I click and drag, it's going to make a line between those the 2 points, one where I start clicking and one where I release the line. You can see that my line has no fill or stroke to it, so when I deselect it, it disappears. It's still there. I can select it, but it needs to have a stroke to it so that I can start seeing it when it's not selected. And the same way as with what we were doing with the rectangles earlier, you can adjust the stroke of the line in the stroke dialog box. So I can change the thickness of it. I can also change the color of it when I have the stroke selected. So I can, instead of black, I can double click and it'll bring up a color picker, and you can choose, you know, any color that you want, and it'll change the stroke to that. Or you can choose from a series of swatches that are kind of defaults within the program. So I can have a blue line and a red line and any number of colors of line. The second option for making a line is if you just click on the screen, if you don't click and drag, it will bring up a dialog box that lets you control the exact dimension and angle of the line. So if I want a line that's exactly 6 inches long at 30 degrees, I can click and and set those options, and then I will have a 6-inch line that's drawn at 30 degrees. So depending on what you're trying to do, you might use one or the other of those versions. If I want a line that has more parts than one segment, if I want a polyline or a line that's made up of many parts, I'm going to use the pen tool, which is the one right above the line tool. And when I use the pen tool, I'm going to just set this to black. I'm going to click multiple points that it's going to draw line segments between. And it's going to keep drawing segments in the same polyline until I tell it to stop somehow. So I can hit enter and it will stop, or the best way to do it is to choose another tool, so to choose the direct selection tool. When I go back and select this object, it now is selecting as all of these line segments together, whereas before, if I were using the line tool, these line segments would be drawn separately and they wouldn't necessarily be connecting at the end, so I might have kind of ugly or messy connections between lines. So if you're going to draw something that has multiple parts, use the polyline tool. You can, using the direct selection tool or the white arrow tool, make adjustments in that polyline. So if I don't like the way it's looking, or if I need to move a point around, I can start doing that with the direct selection tool. I'm clicking on the corner points to adjust it in this way, or I could also click on just the line part and move them around in that way. Or I could use the kind of window selection and choose a number of points that then I can move around separate from the other parts of the object. So that's the kind of basics of lines, polylines, and the interface. We're going to cover some more options in the next part of the tutorial.